Welcome to The Debate. Today we are diving deep into, well, a truly chilling study, Dr. John B. Calhoun's Universo 25. This was an experiment conducted between 1968 and 1973, and it's maybe the ultimate thought experiment made real. A population of Norwegian mice placed in what was designed to be a perfect environment. Unlimited food, unlimited water, climate-controlled, and completely free of predators or disease.
Exactly. The whole point was to remove every external pressure that normally limits population growth, right? To see what would happen. And the result was, it was startling. Despite having the physical space for nearly 4,000 mice, the population peaked at just 2,200 before it suffered a catastrophic social collapse, a total descent into chaos that Calhoun famously called the behavioral sink. And it led, inexorably to the extinction of the entire colony.
And that collapse, crucially, wasn't driven by any material scarcity. It was an internal, pathological failure of the society itself. And that really is the core of our discussion today. We're trying to frame the mechanism of that collapse. Was the extinction driven primarily by something existential? What Calhoun called the first death? This loss of purpose that comes from having all your desires satisfied? Or was it driven by direct structural behavioral pathologies? The hyper-aggressive actions that physically destroyed their ability to reproduce.
And my position is, I think, quite clear on this. The collapse was fundamentally structural. It was caused by these extreme active pathologies that stemmed from really unmanageable social pressure. That pressure, structurally and behaviorally just, prevented successful reproduction. It actively blocked the biological future of the species.
Whereas I would contend that the structural collapse was just the inevitable symptom. The fundamental cause was existential, stemming from that loss of function, the loss of challenge. And this philosophical vacuum was the necessary precondition that allowed all the later behavioral chaos to even happen.
I do understand the allure of the philosophical explanation, I do. But if we actually look at the evidence, at what Calhoun prioritized, the crisis really began in what he called Phase C, the stagnation phase. The population stopped growing, and it wasn't because the mice suddenly lost their collective will to live, but because the social structure, the hierarchy, the defense systems, maternal care, it all became actively hostile to the survival of the young.
But that hostility, that's what I'm getting at, it arose from an initial sociological collapse. The key observation that supports my argument here is Calhoun's conclusion about the first death. He found that when physical needs are met instantly, without any effort, the individual, it loses its function. Life, he argued, loses its logic if there's no need to overcome a challenge. The perfect environment itself became the very mechanism of collapse because it took away that essential struggle. And the definitive proof of this for me is the emergence of the beautiful ones. These were fully viable males who just voluntarily retreated from all social roles. They didn't fight, they didn't mate, they focused only on eating, sleeping, and this obsessive grooming. Their perfect, unscarred appearance, it masked a psychological state of just profound social withdrawal. They were, as Calhoun put it, spiritually dead. And this voluntary abandonment of roles, that shows the crisis began as one of meaning and function. It had to precede the structural failures.
See, that analysis, however eloquent, really feels like it puts the cart before the horse. I come at this from a completely different perspective. The philosophical interpretation of spiritual death is secondary to the immediate, observable, and frankly deadly pathologies that structurally annihilated the next generation. The population stalled because the system, choked with too many established animals, became hostile to the young mice trying to find a place. The crisis was rooted in hyper-aggressivity. We have to look at the pathology of the females, this so-called feminization, and the deviant activity of the probers.
Okay, the loss of maternal instinct was the direct physical kill switch for the colony. Females who were forced to defend their own nests because the males had withdrawn saw their stress levels just skyrocket. This structural pressure led them to reject, to expel, or even to commit cannibalism against their own young, even with unlimited food just sitting there. The final
Critical data point is phase D. Reproduction stopped completely. The last viable birth was on day 600. And that cessation was the active biological destruction of the colony's future, driven by a structural failure, not just some psychological malaise.
That's a powerful point, I'll grant you, but I have to challenge your framing of the beautiful ones as a symptom rather than a cause. You say they were socially defeated, but their perfect physical state argues against that. They weren't scarred. Their self-imposed autism demonstrated the death of the social imperative, the loss of ratonidad, the very essence of being a mouse. Their choice to abandon territory and reproduction created a critical vacuum. When the dominant males decided these roles, defense, hierarchy, had no inherent value, they withdrew. And that withdrawal enabled the chaos. It allowed the provers to run rampant, and it shifted the burden of defense onto the females, which directly caused the stress and the maternal breakdown you're citing.
I'm just not convinced that their withdrawal was the primary trigger. It seems just as plausible and maybe more supported by the density observations that the beautiful ones were simply the socially irrelevant class. They were the ones who managed to insulate themselves from the constant conflict. They didn't have the ability or maybe the inclination to fight the entrenched older males, so they chose self-preservation through isolation in response to an already violent system. If we want to find the active instigators, we have to look at the probers. These males actively violated every core social norm. They didn't do mating rituals, they didn't have territory, they just relentlessly pursued other mice. It was a structural pathology, a breakdown in learned social conduct that tore the family unit apart. They were the active agents of destruction. The beautiful ones were the passive agents of surrender.
But let's connect those two, because the passive surrender of the beautiful ones and the active chaos of the probers are two sides of the same coin, right? It's the rejection of meaningful role-playing. When the traditional, necessary roles establishing a hierarchy, defending borders, when those became irrelevant because life was so easy, the mice who had the capacity for those roles simply abandoned them. And this vacuum of purpose led to two groups, the retirees and the deviants. The probers are essentially mice who never learned appropriate social behavior because the hierarchy that enforced it had already dissolved. The root cause is still the removal of that existential need to struggle.
I would still argue that the immediate action that sealed the colony's fate was the destruction of the family unit. That is purely structural. Calhoun himself observed that extinction happened because viable births they ceased entirely by day 600. The mechanism he cites is relentless infanticide and maternal rejection. I mean, we have to face the biological reality here. It doesn't really matter why the males were treated if the females are actively murdering the offspring. That is a definitive structural blockage that operates independent of the male's psychological state.
I concede that the loss of maternal instinct is the final deadly stroke, of course. But the male's existential collapse provided the evolutionary pressure for that stroke. We're talking cause and effect. If the males had maintained their territorial imperative, they would have fiercely defended the nest boxes. They would have provided the security the females needed to remain non-aggressive and focused on rearing their young. Because the males abandoned their function, the females had to take on these hypermasculine defense roles, which physiologically altered their behavior. The stress, the hormones, and eventually, the breakdown of maternal care. The violence you describe is a systemic reaction to a prior, fundamental abdication of purpose.
That is a compelling model, but it still foregrounds this internal psychological decision over the external overwhelming pressure. Let's talk about the definition of the crisis itself, density. Calhoun was very careful to state the collapse was not due to a lack of physical space. The habitat was 2/3 empty. He called it social density.
Exactly. And that reinforces my thesis. The limitation wasn't space. It was the number of roles available. The utopia was so efficient that all the roles, defender, breeder, were saturated, leading to this massive population of functionless mice. And that functionlessness precipitates the philosophical retreat of the beautiful ones. It's a sociological failure of integration caused by a lack of necessary challenges.
And I would frame that social density differently. While it's not about physical space, the overwhelming, relentless pressure of interacting with too many individuals is what pathologically created the behavioral sink. It wasn't just the lack of a job. It was the constant exposure to violence, the relentless pursuit by probers, the inability to find peace, just the stress. The physical consequences of this pressure, the fighting, the scarring, were the direct agents of extinction, independent of whether an individual mouse was pondering the meaning of his existence. The sheer volume of pathological interactions broke the species.
And yet, if we look at the societal parallels that Calhoun often referenced, the existential explanation just gains so much more weight. Think about the hikikomori in Japan, or the NEETs phenomenon in developed nations. These are individuals who, in societies of hyperabundance and safety, voluntarily withdraw. They are physically capable, but the societal roles offered are either overwhelming or just deemed meaningless. The beautiful ones perfectly embody this. They had the physical tools. Their perfect pelts prove they avoided the worst of the violence, but they chose spiritual death. Calhoun's warning, therefore, is profound. What happens to a civilization when its most capable members decide that consumption and comfort are preferable to contribution and challenge?
I think the structural lens provides a better parallel, actually. Hikikomorian needs aren't just contemplating existential dread. They're responding to structural conditions. Hyper-competition for a limited number of quality roles, a massive cost of living. It's a sense of systemic failure that pushes them out. And similarly, in Universe 25, the probers and the hyper-aggressive females represent that structural failure. The probers were deficient in learned behavior because the adult hierarchy was too congested and stressed to teach them. The warning isn't about philosophy, it's about the failure of structural cohesion and natality in these hyper-complex, comfortable societies.
In the end, we have to acknowledge that the existential vacuum and the structural chaos fed into a truly devastating synergy.
On that, we can absolutely agree. That much is undeniable.
However, looking back, I maintain that the strongest conclusion points toward the fundamental existential flaw built into the very concept of a utopia. By eliminating the necessity of struggle, the environment stripped the individual of purpose. The fate of the beautiful ones, biologically alive but spiritually dead, serves as a profound warning that a loss of function is the foundational precursor to all other pathologies. It's the death of the spirit that comes before physical extinction.
And while that philosophical takeaway is undeniably resonant, the empirical evidence shows that structural behavioral pathologies were the direct, immediate mechanism that destroyed the colony. The unchecked aggression, the total loss of maternal instinct, and the lethal violation of social norms by the probers actively halted reproduction. The primary warning for us is centered on how hyper-developed, comfortable societies might destroy the very structural cohesion necessary to continue. If a system cannot successfully rear its next generation, the species is functionally extinct, regardless of the existential depth of its males.
And so the outcome of Universe 25 really forces us to consider whether the greatest threat is that internal collapse of purpose, or the external structural chaos that arises when comfort and social density erode our most essential behaviors.
There is certainly far more to unpack there. Thank you for this exchange.